Welcome back to Scotty's Hobbies. On this video today, I'm going to show you how to change the front brake pads and rotors on a 2007 to 2011 Honda CR-V. But if you have a different vehicle, the steps are very similar, if not the same, on 90% of floating rotor vehicles that are out there. So make sure you stay tuned. I'm going to give you all the knowledge you need, tell you what tools you need, and give you some tips and tricks, pointers as I go along. First, make sure the vehicle is properly jacked up using the lifting points on the vehicle, and you have a jack stand under the vehicle just in case the vehicle does decide, or the jack stand decides to give out. You have something to catch yourself. First, take the wheel off, easiest thing in the books. I'm also going to give you the torque specs throughout the video as well. Here we are. Got the wheel off. We're going to turn the wheel to the left and make it easier to access the caliper and rotor and all that good stuff, so we have easy access to it. We're going to remove the cap off the reservoir if the fluid needs to escape and we don't blow out any seals or gaskets and just make the job harder. To remove the caliper from the bracket, you will need a 14mm socket. I'm using my impact gun to get these bolts off, but you can use a 3/8 wrench or a open end wrench, whatever you need to use. I wouldn't use open end, but a box end, something like that. 14mm gets these bolts off. After we remove both of the caliper bolts, we are free to take it off. If it doesn't come off easily, if your pads are pushed into your rotor and it's just hard to get off, you might jam a screwdriver in the top of the inspection window of the caliper, pry on the rotor, and that will push the pistons into the caliper a little bit to remove the caliper. After we get the caliper off, we're going to want to inspect the caliper boots on the pistons. Make sure they're not ripped, make sure they're not cracked, they're not leaking. At this point, if they are, you should remove the caliper, or just replace the caliper, that is. And I do have videos in the video library on how to replace calipers and bleed the brakes properly, so check that out if you need to do so. Now that we know that the piston boots look good, we are going to remove the inboard pad. When you remove the pads, make sure you take note of where the wear indicator is located on the pads. On this vehicle is the inboard pad on the top. That's where the wear indicator was located on this one. So we're going to use that old brake pad, put it up in the caliper onto the pistons, and get a caliper compression tool. There are many caliper compression tools out there, but the one I'm using in this video is my favorite tool. I use it on a ton of different calipers, and the dual pistons, or the pistons that are on both sides, it works on those calipers as well. There will be links in the description below to purchase the tools and parts in this video as we go as well. Now that we have the caliper compression tool loaded into the caliper, we want to use that caliper compression tool to push the pistons all the way in the caliper as far as we can. Get them, try to be flush with the caliper if you can, and just make sure that they're pushed all the way in so it's easier to install later on. Now that the caliper pistons are pushed all the way in, double check the boots, make sure everything is good. We don't want to hang the caliper by the brake hose or the brake line. You might do some damage, you might crack the line, you might break the line. I've never had that happen, but better safe than sorry. I use a S-hook to hold the caliper up onto the spring or the shock, anywhere that I could just hang it from somewhere so it's not being, well, the pressure's not being put on that hose. After we get the brake caliper hung up there on the spring, it's time to move on to the next step. This whole thing is really fast too. This whole process takes about 45 minutes for the whole brake job if you have all this knowledge. So it's really, really quick to do it by yourself. You're going to save yourself a ton of money doing it by yourself too. And if you watch this video, the whole thing, you're going to have all the knowledge. Let's remove the brake caliper bracket from the knuckle. Now, to remove the brake caliper bracket from the knuckle, you are going to be using a 19mm socket. To remove the caliper bracket, you're going to need a 19mm socket and possibly a 1/2-inch socket wrench if you have one laying around. These bolts are tightened up pretty good. The torque specifications I'll give you later on in the video are pretty tight on the knuckle bolts, or the caliper to knuckle bolts that is. So a 1/2-inch socket wrench is probably going to suffice better in this situation. Remove both the top and bottom bolts, take off the caliper bracket, and set it off to the side. We're going to get ready to remove the rotor, but we are going to clean up the caliper bracket, put new hardware and stuff on, so just set it off to the side for now. Now, to remove the rotor from this hub, there's 2 screws holding this rotor onto the hub. These are called production screws. I personally like to reinstall these production screws. It makes it so that the rotor doesn't wobble around when you're reinstalling everything, which makes it much easier in my opinion. To remove these screws, we're going to use an impact screwdriver, or an impact driver. When using the impact driver, you're going to put the driver onto the screws, turn the driver in the direction you want to turn it, but do not push in. Let the hammer, when you hit it, do the actual turning of the screwdriver. That'll impact the screw to be able to turn. Now that we have the production screws out, we could go ahead and remove the rotor. This rotor was kind of hard to get off. Yours might be too. Just whack it with a hammer a couple times. If you're going to reuse the rotor or resurface it, you might want to take a little bit more care on how you remove this rotor. Maybe a dead blow hammer or a mallet, a rubber mallet, would be a better situation or a better tool to use in this situation if you're going to reuse the old rotors. With the rotor off, let's go ahead and clean up the hub surface. I'm using a polishing kit or a hub cleaning kit that you could buy on Amazon or eBay. With this kit, it slides right over the lug nut studs, and you can clean the surface right there on the hub. And then I will go all the way around, and then I'll use the same tool to clean between each one of the lug nuts. With the hub surface all cleaned off, no more rust on it, no debris on it, let's get the rotor prepped for installation. What I like to do is hang the rotor on the hub. I'll spray off one side with brake clean, turn it over, and then I'll spray the other side with brake clean just to remove all the production oils and stuff that are on there, or the stuff that gets accumulated while sitting on the shelf. Get that nice and clean. With all that stuff cleaned off, set the rotor on a bucket, on a table, something like that. Just don't touch the surface of the rotor, and apply anti-seize to the inside of the rotor. You can apply anti-seize to the hub. Other people do that. That's not the wrong way to do it, but I like to do it the way I am, just so I avoid getting a bunch of anti-seize on the lug nuts. With anti-seize evenly applied all the way around on the surface of the rotor, I'll clean the little holes out on the rotor, make sure I don't get any anti-seize on there, so when I'm sliding it on the hub, I don't get a ton of anti-seize on the lug nuts. Let's go ahead and put that rotor onto the hub. With the rotor on the hub, I'm going to reinstall the production screws. Again, at this point, you could just use a lug nut to hold the rotor in place while you're reassembling everything, but I like to use the production screws if they are available to reuse. When you're removing these, they say you need a special tool, but I just use the General Phillips that comes in the impact driver kit. Just a little side note right there. Now that we have the production screws back in, the rotor firmly held up, wipe off the lug nut studs just so you don't have any anti-seize on there, just so you don't forget later. Make sure everything's nice and clean so when you put the wheel on, if you have anti-seize on there, the lug nuts can come off. You don't want to torque down anything with anti-seize on it. With the rotor on there, let's prep the bracket for installation. We're going to install a new hardware kit, lube up the sliders, all that good stuff. When you're purchasing a brake pad kit, make sure you get a kit that includes new hardware. I personally like to replace the hardware every time I do a brake job. I never reuse old hardware if I can, which is pretty much every time. Now, the hardware kit pops right out. Now we're going to clean the sliders off. Make sure the sliders slide in and out easily. You don't want to have any type. So bright in here. With the hardware kit installed on the caliper bracket, let's prep the sliders now. We want to make sure that the sliders easily slide in and out. You don't want these to be hampered when they move, because this is what is going to allow the caliper to move off of the pads or to release the pads off of the rotor. So if these don't move, your brake pads are going to wear out way faster. It's really important to make sure that these sliders are really clean, properly lubed, and slide in and out. All I'm going to do is remove each slider. I'm going to wipe these ones off. They're really clean. If you have any gunk that's built up on them, you might want to use a wire brush or some brake clean to clean all that gunk off before you reapply some grease. I'm using some purple ceramic grease to lube up my slider pins. So you could do the same, but there are different variations out there that you could purchase as well. When you finally get your sliders all cleaned off and lubed up, when you reinstall them back into the caliper bracket again, make sure they move in and out, and check the boots. Make sure there's no rips or cracks. When you push the slider pins in and out of the bracket, make sure there's no grease that's coming out of those boots. So you want to make sure you have good boots. Again, if these boots are cracked or ripped or anything, replace them now before you go any further. The hardware kit was a little hard to get them in on the other side, so I learned how to do it on this side. You have to use your thumb and push it up into the caliper bracket and then clip the sides in, and it slides right in. Make sure that the hardware kit is firmly in the caliper bracket. You don't want it to be loose or anything like that. You don't want these to rub on the rotor and cause a squeaking sound later on after you do your brake job and have to take everything apart and just readjust these hardware kits, or the shims I think you should call them. I don't know what they really call them, but the hardware kit. With the hardware kit properly installed, now that everything is prepped and ready to be installed, let's go ahead and install the prepped bracket over the rotor. When installing the bracket, this is where torque specifications come into play, and I think that they are very important. Now these 19mm bolts that hold the bracket onto the knuckle are torqued down to 101 foot-pounds. You might be wondering where I get my torque specifications from, and let me show you real quick. This right here is the Motor Guide Brake Specifications Guidebook. It has a ton of information in it that helps me do a lot of brake jobs. So if you're doing a different vehicle and this video is helping you get through that vehicle, comment below or shoot me a text and I will get you the proper brake torque specifications for that vehicle as well. Again, 19mm, 101 foot-pounds torqued down on these bolts. Now that we have the caliper bracket installed over the rotor, let's go ahead and install the new brake pads. Don't forget, the wear indicator on the old pads was on the inboard pad on the top side. So we want to make sure that the wear indicator is in the same location when we reinstall the new brake pads. The old brake pads also didn't have the return springs that went on top of the brake pads. I'm not sure if that is because those were cheaper pads or just a different design, but use the hardware that is given when you buy your new pads. So I am installing new springs on top of the brake pads. What these do is when you let off the brake pedal, these springs on top will help release the pads off of the rotor so you don't have any extra rubbage and increased wear on the brake pads. So I think that these springs, if they're provided in your kit, are very important. Now that we have the pads installed in the caliper bracket, we have the springs installed on the pads themselves. Now we're ready to put the compressed piston caliper over the brake pads onto the brake caliper bracket. Now these bolts on the brake caliper, they're really small, fine thread, really easy to strip out and really easy to break. These caliper to bracket bolts are torqued down to 37 foot-pounds. So 14mm socket and 37 foot-pounds. Very important at this point. Torque specifications, you know that everything is properly tightened down. You're not over tightened, you're not under tightened, which would allow the bolts to back off and eventually the brake caliper just come off the bracket later on, and hey, that's just gonna cause a whole bunch of more drama for you later. So torque specifications, very important in my opinion. Now that you have everything put back together, the brake caliper bracket, everything torqued down, go ahead and go up to the brake fluid reservoir and just close that cap. You might have some leakage that came down under the vehicle from when you compress the pistons back into the caliper, and don't be alarmed. That's totally fine, totally normal. You might be able to see some spots on the floor from when they'd actually escaped from the reservoir, the brake fluid escaped from the reservoir when I was doing that process. Fluid reservoir cap back on, get in the car and pump the brake pedal. Pump it until you get nice and firm. Go double check, make sure you don't have any leaks or anything like that, and also double check the brake fluid reservoir level. If everything looks good, you're ready to put the wheel back onto the rotor and you'll be done with your brake job. Now the next important step is to properly tighten the wheel onto the hub. The torque specification for the wheel onto the hub on this vehicle is 80 foot-pounds. When you're tightening up the lug nuts, you want to make sure you go in a star pattern to make sure that the wheel is evenly applied onto the hub to avoid early wear on the rotors or the brake pads, all that good stuff. So torque specifications on your lug nuts is pretty important as well. A star pattern, if you're not using a torque wrench, a star pattern is the most important part, or the second most important part, to when you're installing the wheel. If this video helped you get your brake job done, comment below. Let me know the year, make, model of your vehicle. Just let me know that this video helped you out. I really like to know that my videos help everybody. Hopefully it did. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Tell everybody about Scotty's Hobbies, and I will see you guys on the next hopefully helpful video.